Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, June 7th, 2020, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2020 Senate elections and pretty much just giving you guys an update on the information that we have about these races. So on your screen right now is my current prediction as of June 2020 for the United States Senate. I know it seemed like a long shot for Democrats a long time ago, or just a couple of months ago actually, at winning back the United States Senate, considering that they were already giving up a seat in Alabama and then from then needed to make a gain 4 seats. But it doesn't seem too improbable taking a look at this overall map. This would be an outright majority. They would not need Vice President Biden to win the election, and thus the vice presidential nominee being the tiebreaker vote in the United States Senate. But what I will say is that it is very interesting that the Democratic Party is able to even get this far. The reason why is because Steve Bullock is running in Montana. Tom Tillis in North Carolina is up for a tough re-election bid. Gary Peters is holding on to his race in Michigan. Martha McSally was appointed as the Republican senator from Arizona. Cory Gardner is just vastly unpopular, and as is Susan Collins. And it doesn't look like in some of these other areas the Democrats are vulnerable. So there are some few key reasons as to why the Democratic Party has a very large possibility of winning back the United States Senate, on top of the fact that these numbers could either solidify or fluctuate back to the Republican Party. But I do think that you guys should take a look at the numbers, and I should present them to you because they are pretty important. So on your screen right now is the Real Clear Politics Battle for the Senate 2020 map. They give the Republicans 49 seats that are either safe, likely, or lean, meaning if the Republican Party wins the election and wins any one of the 6 toss-up seats in their toss-up column, they win back the United States Senate. However, taking a look at some of these states that are considered toss-ups, there is a very real possibility the Democratic Party carries them. I do not agree with the characterizations that New Hampshire and New Mexico are lean, nor do I agree with the characterization that Texas, should be lean at this point. I know I did characterize it as lean, but I'm a lot more favorable to the GOP in the state of Texas right now. I do think that with everything that's happening recently, while I do think that minority turnout will be higher, I also think white turnout will also be higher. And there will also be a lot more money spent on these races than in the past. Texas, while being very expensive in 2018, disregarding that, John Cornyn was a shoo-in in 2014. It was a Republican wave year, and I do think that the Republican Party is going to try to cover their bases in Texas. There's some new polls out just 2-3 days ago that show Biden and Trump neck and neck, and I do think that the Republican Party is going to try to at least retain, which they definitely will, but retain a conservative win in the state of Texas, whether that's in the Senate elections or the presidential elections. Republican ads are going to be spent, and I do think that it is going to bring out white voters as well as minority voters. But again, that was a map as the direct result of what's happening nationwide. But Texas, I'm thinking about moving over into the likely, maybe 6-7%, but I don't think it should be considered lean. It's also very surprising to me that Real Clear Politics does consider it lean. Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee. I don't necessarily think Tennessee is going to be likely, even though it is an open seat. I don't think that's going to have a huge implication on the race. It's still a solid GOP state. But what I will say is that Alabama, I would move over into the lean GOP column. For Kentucky and Mississippi, these are states that I consider to be likely on my own map. That's just because of the rematch that's happening in Mississippi after a previous 8-point race. And Kentucky, of course, Mitch McConnell was going to win, but again, super unpopular. So still some people are going to vote for Amy McGrath. But for these toss-up states, let's go ahead and take a look. Let's go ahead and take a look at Arizona first. So this one, based off polling numbers, I don't see why it's considered a toss-up. If this was a margin in a presidential election, it's rivaling states such as Colorado or New Mexico, which means that they should be considered likely for the Democratic Party. But I don't think that's going to happen. But taking a look at 2018, the Republican Party was supposed to win this race. Martha McSally was up on election day and ended up losing by 2.3%. And you know what happens? It's not that she runs again. Nope. Doug Ducey appoints her to be the United States Senator following John McCain, and she's up for re-election in 2020. And of course, it's not going to end up well because she was rejected by voters once and now likely to be again. Taking a look at the data now, she only led in the first ever polls that were taken. OH Predictive Insights. We're only a couple of percentage points off in 2018. They have since, valuing the same sample, moved up to Mark Kelly at being plus 13 statewide. So that shows you, number one, how weak Martha McSally is as a candidate, going from leading originally down to being behind 13%. And it's not like that's the only poll showing that. Univision, Monmouth, Fox News, I mean, they all agree with either a double-digit margin or a very solid margin for the Democratic Party in Arizona, enough to a point where even I am considering characterizing it as likely Democrat. I know it's going to narrow up on Election Day, but it is just very fascinating that it's that close. John Hickenlooper, even though there are things going on with the Ethics Committee, do you really think it's going to be close? It's a Senate race in Colorado, a pretty solid Democratic state at this point, and Cory Gardner votes with Trump 50% more of the time than he should. And when you're talking about that, it's going to obviously be his entire voting record is going to be used against him when he runs for re-election. Well, he is running for re-election against a previously popular governor from Colorado. So I don't think the Democratic Party has anything to worry about in the state of Colorado. As for Maine, Sarah Gideon, according to this data, should win. If you take a look at Susan Collins' previous margins, 2014 plus 37. If you take a look at, I did not know the map, the website looked like this in 2014. That looks so horrible. But, she led by she won by 37%. In 2008, she won by 23%. So she never really had a competitive race except for her first ever election. So I honestly think Susan Collins is going to have a very difficult time winning re-election this time around. She has become the most unpopular senator nationwide. You take a look prior to the 2016 election, she was right up there with Bernie Sanders. In fact, more approved of by her constituents than Bernie Sanders. Now, she is the most unpopular senator nationwide based off of her constituency. 52% of her, 52% of the people in Maine disapprove of her. 42% approve of her. So it's still a little bit contested. However, I will say that it is a very stark contrast from when she had a 73% approval rating and a 13% disapproval rating. So her race is definitely going to be super competitive. Sarah Gideon has a real shot, especially if the Democratic Party is able to drive up the numbers between Obama to Trump voters and win them back on the Biden campaign and thus making them vote down ballot. For Michigan, Gary Peters, I honestly don't think is going to face too tough of a re-election bid, though John James did run in 2018, and the margin was a little bit narrower than expected. I honestly don't think that he's going to have a super clear shot at winning this time around. Debbie Stabenow and Gary Peters are very similar in terms of approval. I will say that Gary Peters is I would characterize as a weaker candidate, but I don't think John James really has a shot, especially with the overall election expected to go to Joe Biden at this point. If Trump was to win, it is possible for John James to carry that state, but the Senate elections and House elections typically end up better for Democrats, even when they don't win the presidential election. So as we move over to the state of Montana, Steve Daines is the incumbent. There's no polling data here, surprisingly, but he's running against Steve Bullock, who was actually elected as governor. I don't know why I clicked that one. Elected as governor in 2016 on the same ballot as Donald Trump. While the race was mildly close, and it was closer than what the polling data had indicated, he still won on the same ballot that Donald Trump had a very solid victory. 20.5% of the vote in Montana went for Donald Trump, and Steve Bullock still won the election. He ends up being popular, ran for president, and now it looks like, even with that Republican wave on the presidential level, it wasn't enough to kick him out from the governor's office, and it looks like that race could end up going to the Democrats as well. In North Carolina, Cal Cunningham is running against Tom Tillis, the Republican incumbent, who won in 2014, despite this race being, despite the election being a very solid Republican wave year. Kay Hagan, the Democratic incumbent, actually led in polling data, and Tom Tillis only ended up winning by 1.7%. And the reason why that's so important is because if you take a look at some other states in the South, such as Arkansas, or just a number of other states around the country, there were 9 Republican pickups, and in states such as Arkansas, it was a very solid GOP victory. It was not close just because there was a Democratic incumbent. So Kay Hagan, number one, was a very strong candidate, but Tom Tillis is a very inherently weak one, and it's reflecting based off these numbers alone. Even if Donald Trump does carry the state of North Carolina, it is a very real possibility that the Democratic Party does pick up a Senate seat there, as they did in the governor's office in 2016. Let's go ahead and find Tom Tillis' approval rating on here. Probably should be somewhere down here. I don't know if they... right here, 34% to 37%. So he's mildly unknown by his constituency, and I think that's going to be really difficult for him if Cal Cunningham makes a name for himself. And also, a 34% approval rating isn't necessarily good. It really needs to be a little bit higher than that, at least, if you want to be at least super competitive in your race. And I do think that the Republican Party is going to forget about that race, and it's going to end up going to the Democrats if we continue at this point. As we look at some of these other races, again, I don't agree with the characterization that Virginia, Oregon, New Jersey are considered safe, nor do I consider any of these races as lean either. For the toss-up races, some of these, obviously, I've made characterizations in all of them. For the lean GOP ones, I don't know if there's any polling data. Kelly Loeffler, so this is just an open primary, so we don't need to worry about that. Joni Ernst, I do agree with this one being lean, but I will say that I do want to see some data from there first. For Kansas, I don't know if this is, they haven't included it, but there is some polling data there, so maybe there is in some other states. But again, so that's pretty much just an update on the overall Senate map. Though it looks like the Republican Party is starting off with a very large advantage, a number of these seats, Arizona, Colorado, Michigan, Maine, are going to be pretty easy, or at least not super easy in terms of Maine, but for the rest of them, pretty easy for the Democrats to win. They just really need to up their game in North Carolina and Montana, and I guess you could say Maine. But that leaves a number of opportunities for the Democratic Party. The GOP, while defending some of these races, is going to start to see a little bit more competitiveness in Kansas, depending on who the GOP nominee is going to be, or possibly in Iowa, or if Kelly Loeffler does end up becoming the Republican nominee in Georgia's second election, or Georgia's special election. It should be very critical for the GOP to retain some of these seats, because even if they're winning seats here, and let's say they lose one in Kansas or lose one in Georgia, but win one in the toss-up column, still the same result for the Democratic Party. They still end up winning the Senate election. So, again, while the Republican Party may seem like they have an overall advantage, they really don't. And the Democratic Party has a lot more energy behind them than they just did a couple of months ago, and a lot more enthusiastic voters than probably what we will see for the remainder of the election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to consider pressing the join button next to my channel. It really helps me out tremendously, and I made a whole video on that, so when you click it, it'll probably come up. But yeah, thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you all later today.